All right, well, good morning, everyone. Hope you're back from your morning coffee break and ready to join us for today's webinar. We're very happy to be joined by First Point Global and John Havers for this ABAC or Attribute-Based Access Control webinar and how you can apply that to data access. Now, if you're familiar with webinars, you'll be familiar with this. We do mute all of your lines centrally for better audio quality. We will be recording the session so that it can be played back later on. The slides also will be available. And at the end, we have some time for questions and answers. And if some question comes to mind during the session, please do type that into the GoToWebinar question box. So today's speaker is myself. I'm Jerry Gable with Axiomatics. As I mentioned, John Havers from First Point Global is joining us. And David Brossard, my colleague, will also be online to talk more about architecture and even a demo. So you can follow us on Twitter, and First Point Global. We also follow the hashtags ABAC or XACML, and we'll make comments on that. And you can also post questions on Twitter and find us there. So we're going to start with a bit of introduction. John and I do a little bit of commentary and preamble. We'll also look at business drivers and why organizations are looking to invest in this attribute-based access control or ABAC model. We'll be looking at a number of business challenges and what problems can be solved there, and also the business benefits and how ABAC can supplement your business processes. And then we'll go into more of a technical overview, at least from a high level. And as I mentioned, have a demonstration on one of our newer products that shows how the ABAC model can be applied to database access control. We're pretty excited about that. So to continue on here, when we talk to customers and we look at what's happening in the, we see that our environments are getting more complex, driven by macro trends like bring your own device, cloud computing, of course, has been around for a while, big data as well, and now, of course, the Internet of Things. So we see more and more places where data is being housed and accessed, and it's really stretching the limits of some of the traditional or legacy access control models. And John, I imagine you're seeing a lot of this as well when you talk to your customers.
Yeah, that's an emphatic yes, Jerry. In Australia, more than 50% of Australians and New Zealanders have smartphones and tablets and whatnot. And in this digital economy now, consumers are demanding better and richer online experiences anytime, anywhere, and from any device. So I guess this is referred to as the digital economy, where data is in fact the new gold. So it's how we can use this data, how our customers can use this data to build closer relationships with their customers and provide compelling online services. Now, corporations and governments in Australia and New Zealand have been investing in technologies that expose and unify this data, both legacy data and new big data. So right now we're seeing many initiatives around enterprise API and unifying directories, and of course ABAC, which is proving to be the icing on the cake.
Right, because our premise is that you cannot excuse me, that you cannot use legacy access control models in this modern world, right? They're more like band-aids. They just are not appropriate. That's not the right fit. And that's where we think a next generation security model, such as described and implemented by ABAC, gives you a much more dynamic model. And that's really what's more in tune with how businesses are operating today in a much more dynamic and collaborative fashion. And we'll see collaboration being one of those key business objectives in the coming slides. And you can't to just lock down data either, and that's also what's been done historically. It's either on or off, and that doesn't fit modern business agility and requirements. So what we think the ABAC model enables is one that allows you to share even sensitive and business critical and the most valuable and regulated data that you have with the right audience, so that you can generate the right access in the right context, the right user experience, and not just to data, but even to things now when you think of the Internet of Things world. And John, I think this is where you and I talk about on occasion of how trying to implement an RBAC model when you have such a dynamic business environment really breaks down pretty quickly and causes a lot of pain for customers.
Yeah, that's too true, Jerry. We've, I guess, had a number of false starts over the years with customers, and the conclusion was that untangling RBAC and the applications associated with it is just too large a challenge. ABAC perhaps holds the key.
Indeed, and I think you want to talk more about why you see some organizations investing in this area.
Correct. So as technologists, we see ABAC as a very compelling authorization model. The advantages of it are that we can simplify the infrastructure, we can write something once and enforce it everywhere. We can apply a consistent authorization model or policies across multiple applications. We change it and it is reflected everywhere. Business enablement is the key to today's discussion, and we're seeing our customers exposing this data so that they can drive a lot of business value. And not to forget compliance. Compliance with respect to security and policy are very important, and ABAC gives us the ability to simplify defining and auditing against compliance. So if we could talk about now this innovation in the digital economy, Jerry and David will guide us through some really interesting use cases which enable business agility and the delivery of richer and more compelling online experiences for our customers. Through this, we'll have better access and usage of both legacy data and the masses of new big data which are being accumulated. We'll be looking a little deeper into two areas, the advantages that can be gained through context-aware information management, and we'll be looking at a special case where ABAC is applied to database filtering, allowing us to unlock the value of legacy data, circumventing the complexities of both applications and database security. Jerry.
All right, thanks, John. And remember, I told you earlier I've got a trick question hidden for you, so you need to pay attention as we proceed here. And a couple other notes.
Yes,
all right, thanks, John. And a couple other notes here, just to bring in some external validation. Our friends at Gartner have recently been talking a lot about ABAC, and one of the quotes they made at our Identity and Access Management Summit earlier this year was that by 2020, which is not that far away now, 70% of enterprises will use ABAC as the dominant mechanism to protect critical assets. And you can see they predict, or they suspect that it's only around 5% today. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us. In addition, our other analyst friends over at Kubinger Cole recently published a report on dynamic authorization management. That's what they call this market. And one of the areas they focused on was innovation and how that can drive customer satisfaction, and had published that Axiomatics leads the sector in the product innovation within the dynamic authorization market. And so you can actually get a copy of that report off our website, some interesting reading there. All right, so as I mentioned earlier in the preamble, we're going to look at some different kinds of business challenges to see what problems we can solve and what benefit we can gain from applying ABAC. These are the four kinds of business scenarios we're going to look at: secure collaboration, rapid and secure transactions, compliance and governance. It seems that never escapes us, and also timely IT service delivery. So if we first look at secure collaboration, I've got to believe almost every organization, public or private sector, that relies on some form of collaboration. And this gets back to talking about sharing those extremely valuable and interesting digital assets, because that's where the business value also is. And if you can do this right, if you can do it well, we think it leads to a competitive advantage, and that's also what some of our customers have told us. But again, when we look back at legacy access controls, which are often embedded within an application itself, hard-coded into the application, we find that it's just not well suited for the modern business world, because so often, if you can log the system, you can see everything. If you can't log in, then you can see nothing. And of course, that's just too blunt of an instrument for the kind of business relationships and scenarios which are so much more subtle than that bring in so much different context. Where are you accessing the data from? What kind of device? If it's a BYOD, is it registered with the system or not? Is this during working hours? What's the requester's relationship to the data? These are the challenges that a more dynamic access model can support. And so we'll talk about the ABAC factor for each of these four scenarios, and with a dynamic and context-based authorization system, now you can open up that information sharing and provide the right access and the right experience for those users, whether it's people in different departments within the same organization, customers accessing their own data, business partners, and so on. So next up is rapid and secure transactions, and this can mean lots of different things, but we're talking here about speed of operations versus the security of operations, and these are often at odds, right? You're typically trading off one or the other. You try to go too fast, and maybe you expose too much risk or expose too much data. You go slower, and then of course you're slowing down the business and maybe not reacting as fast to changing competitive scenarios. Also, we see so often that administrators just trying to do the easy thing end up creating toxic combinations or violating separation of duty failures, and this is what we think ABAC can also address, because we think you can get both the right security, the right access control, and the speed of operation that that organizations are looking for. Because within an ABAC system, you externally or centrally define the access rules in the policy language, and this is what allows you to be very flexible and fast, and also very precise, without sacrificing the security. So for example, if a policy says that a transaction over a certain amount can only be approved by a line manager during office hours, and if they're logged onto the local network, well, that can be easily represented in a ABAC policy and also easily enforced in real time. So John, if you're paying attention, here's your trick question. We can make this sort of analogy. So what makes a car able to go fast? Or did I stump you?
No, actually, Jerry, I heard your question, but I just wasn't fast enough on the stop, button. On the brake, sure. So yes, I guess we're looking at engine size. We're looking at the type of fuel that we use, and I guess in my case, how fast I press the accelerator.
Right. I mean, that's sort of the first reaction that most people have, but it's really the brakes that will allow you to go fast, because you can the situation. You can control when you need to slow down curve or for other traffic. So it's really brakes that make allow a car to go really fast. And we think ABAC is the same thing. It allows a business to go really fast because you have that ability to slow down access when it's inappropriate. So that's my trick question for the day. Thank you for being a willing participant.
And thank you for tricking me.
Okay. All right, next up, the third business scenario we want to talk about is compliance and governance. And John, you touched on this here, and it goes back to what I said just moments ago about having a policy language in the ABAC model, because instead of hard coding all the access controls into each application, we can define that centrally and then enforce it in real time across applications. So think of this from a management or an audit point of view, it seems rather obvious. When you turn around and talk to a developer, they don't always see the big picture, because to them it's an externality. They only have their one application to deal with, which could be fine in a small environment, but if you multiply this across hundreds or even thousands of applications, that's when the overall cost to the organization starts to pile up. This is when it becomes difficult to audit and try to figure out who does have access to what. And then, of course, when you need to change policies, that also causes a lot of heartburn for customers. So again, going back to the ABAC factor here, well, by contrast, because you have this central definition and enforcement of the access policies, it's so much easier now to audit the environment to determine what controls are in place, to prove those controls to outside regulators or to your customers, or to now consistently enforce those access rules across a range of applications instead of relying on the hard-coded, possibly incorrect access control that's embedded within your applications. And somehow I've gone to the last slide here. Apologize. So if we go now next to timely service delivery, this also points a little bit to developers, but also to IT in general, because unfortunately IT is known for excessive times to deliver or enable services and roll out new products. That we can obviously be a roadblock to business agility, and we think IT needs to be able to operate at the speed of business as well. If you look at from the developer's point of view, if they're writing these snippets of code hundreds of times over, that's obviously a lot of time wasted as opposed to just calling an external service. And we think an ABAC model also makes your policy administrators' lives a lot easier, whether that's a system admin, a business analyst, or an application owner tasked with authoring those policies. So I think overall you can improve your developers' time to market with new products and services, improve or reduce the time to make changes, to maintain the environment, and also overall to provide a much lower cost of ownership. If your organization has done some study on the software development costs, excuse me, obviously this will vary across different industries, but we've seen some customers say they can achieve a 10 to even 40% cost savings. And obviously the more complex your authorization rules, the likely the greater potential savings for you. And then certainly in change management, that's not something to be overlooked, because no system remains the same. Policies change, regulations change. We've seen this particularly in the issue of privacy regulations, how they're changing so much around the globe, including within the Australian market space. So from here, I've talked at a high level about some business scenarios and where ABAC can provide business value. Now I'll hand over to David to talk more technically how do we do this in a couple of different architectures. So David, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. So when it comes to using attribute-based access control within your environment, what you want to look at is where you want to do the protection. So you want to think about your enterprise architecture as a layer cake, as a set of layers in a way. And if you look at your architecture, therefore, in those set of layers, you're going to have usually a presentation layer, the presentation tier, and then if you go down from there, you might have a set of APIs, and then you might have a business tier with enterprise service buses. And if you go further down from that layer, you eventually end up in your data tier or in your data layer. So with ABAC, you get a chance to apply authorization at the right location where it matters most to you and give fine-grained access control to the right processes to the right locations. And more specifically, we focus on two areas where we can do the fine-grained authorization. The first one is for applications as a whole. And when we mention applications, of course, we also include APIs. John mentioned the API economy earlier. Of course, whenever you have APIs well-defined, or web services for that matter, it means that you've already agreed on a service contract between a client and a set of business processes. This is where you will want to apply the fine-grained authorization, the dynamic authorization to those calls, to those APIs, to determine which methods are allowed. And it's not just a matter of who is using the API, but also how they're using the API, what messages they're sending, what are the parameters to those messages, how often they're using those APIs, and with which values within those messages. All these are parameters that will determine whether a given user has the right to access that given API and the right to consume the information provided by the API. More specifically, if we have a look at the architecture, the way it works is extremely simple. You have a user or a client process. Here we have user Bob, and user Bob wants to use an application. And that application will be exposed by a contract. It could be an API, it could be a business process in an enterprise service bus. It could be many different types of applications. And what will happen is that with dynamic authorization, you have the notion of an interceptor or policy enforcement point here represented by a traffic light. And that interceptor will intercept the business flow between the client, user Bob, and the application. The interceptor will be responsible for converting that will be responsible for converting that business request into an authorization request, which will be sent off to the external authorization service. Now, with dynamic authorization, that flow is standardized, and effectively what you end up with is a binary yes-no question. Here in the diagram, the example is, can Bob access record 22? And you send that off to that authorization service, and the authorization service is policy-based, which means it's configured with policies. Those policies use attributes to determine what is allowed and what is not allowed. So not only can you have positive policies, you can also have negative policies about what is allowed and not allowed. The authorization service will evaluate the incoming authorization request against those policies, and potentially also it might need to retrieve, or it can retrieve additional metadata, additional information about the context, about the user, about the resource. In this example here, you might imagine that the authorization service wants to turn to an LDAP or a database to retrieve Bob's role, to retrieve Bob's citizenship, Bob's clearance. Similarly, the authorization service might want to retrieve metadata about the record. Are we dealing with a medical record? Are we dealing with a confidential or a highly secret record? All these are parameters that the authorization service will use to reach a decision. And you can see here in the diagram that the decision that will be returned to the interceptor or the traffic light is either a yes permit or a no deny decision. And eventually, the traffic light will be responsible for implementing or enforcing the decision. In the case of a permit, of course, access is allowed and the business call goes through to the application. In the case of a deny, of course, the call would be bounced back or an error message would be created. Now, what's really cool and what's really important about using ABAC and the architecture promoted by ABAC is that the interceptor, the traffic light, can adapt to the different types of applications you're dealing with. So if you're dealing with a content management system such as SharePoint, or if you're dealing with web services protected by an XML gateway or an API gateway, or if you're dealing with yet another type of application, that's fine. That's fine because you will have the right form factor for your interceptor for the traffic light that will intercept the flow, and in every single case, no matter the application, that interceptor will be able to send off the authorization request in a standardized way to the external authorization service to get that decision back and enforce the decision. So it's define authorization once in one location and enforce everywhere, no matter the type of the application. And going the extra mile in that direction, we can also apply the very same authorization principle to data filtering, to databases. In a way, it's the final frontier. Not only are we content with protecting APIs, web services, presentation tiers, portals, mobile apps, we could also apply dynamic authorizations to databases, to data inside databases. And that is a very interesting concept, of course, because the sheer scale changes. You're no longer dealing with one web service call, one web service method, one process within a business process. You're dealing with potentially millions, hundreds of millions of data records, be it bank accounts, be it medical records, be it insurance claims. So the scale of applying authorization for data is very different. And yet, in spite of that, ABAC is a great fit. It still works. And the way it works in the product that we have at Axiomatics, the Axiomatics Data Access Filter, is that we apply essentially the same architecture. You have a client application on the left-hand side, and you have the data storage on the back end. It could be an Oracle database, and that's what I'll be using for the demo today. It could also be a different type of database. Either way, the application typically sends a SQL statement to the backend database, and that SQL statement will be intercepted by the Axiomatics Data Access Filter. And what that will do, the Data Access Filter comes in two parts: one interceptor for your database flow, a database proxy, if you will, and the authorization engine part of the Data Access Filter. What the proxy will do is intercept the SQL statement, analyze it, convert it to an authorization request. In this example, Bob wants to select everything from table T, send that off to the authorization service. The authorization service is configured with the exact same set of authorization policies, the exact same set of policy information points or external attribute sources. Based on the policies, based on the incoming authorization request, based on the external sources of attributes, the authorization service will reach a decision. But instead of reaching a decision in terms of a yes or a no, it reaches a decision in terms of a filter expression, which in SQL turns out to be a new select statement that will define exactly which columns can be selected, in this example, A or B, and in addition, perhaps more importantly, the where clause that implements the filter. The whole SQL statement is returned to the proxy, and the proxy, instead of using the original select statement, will apply the new select statement, will send it off to the database in such a way that the only data ever retrieved from the database is actually entitled data. There's really a couple of key benefits to using fine-grained authorization at the data level. On the one hand, Jerry, as you probably know, the closer you are to what you're protecting, the better you protect that thing. Well, the same applies to IT. The closer you are to the data you're protecting, and the better you will be protecting it. That's one aspect. And the other aspect, again, driving the scale and the performance using authorization at the data level lets you achieve fine-grained authorization for larger amounts of data than you would be able to if you did it within the application level. Now, I believe, Jerry, that you mentioned you wanted me to run a bit of a demo, so this might actually be a good time to switch over.
Okay, let's do that.
All right. So in the demo that I'm running, let me bring up my little SQL developer. For those of you familiar with this tool, this is the Oracle SQL developer, which is essentially a client that you use to connect to Oracle databases in the backend. So here I'm using Oracle as a database, and my use case is directly inspired from one of our Australian customers down under. We're dealing with a police force, and the police force has data within a database that deals with cases. You can see here on the left-hand side, I have my series of tables. So I have a police case, I have case associations, I have events, operations. All this is data that describes the information the police force maintains. Now, depending on who my user is, I may want to control access to the case data. And roughly speaking, the authorization policy we have here is that you can only see cases that belong to your station, that belong to your region. Now, if I run a pretty standard select statement, select star from case, if I run that as my system user or as the Scott user where authorization has not been applied, so this particular account can access the entire database, if I go ahead and run that, what will happen is that I will get access to the entire set of police cases from my database. And you can see here, I've just run my statement, and below I have the output of my script, and I can see a case ID, I can see a case narrative, and if I scroll down, you'll see that I believe I have 120 cases in total. Again, the case number and the description, which is a slight deviation from your usual mom and pop English. We use some random Latin words here to show the point. So if I use an unprotected user account where I'm not applying any fine-grained authorization, I'm getting all the data back. In this case, I'm getting all 20 rows of the data back. However, if I want to provide fine-grained authorization to the database, what I will do is apply fine-grained authorization to my Oracle database. And what I will then need to do is I will need to pass in my user ID and the value for that user ID. So here I'm going to be user 1001. And notice as well that instead of connecting as my system user to the database, I'll connect to a special user, a system account called app user. That system account has the right authorization policies applied to it, which means that if I go ahead and run the statement select star from Scott case, if I run it without the statements, it will not work. And then if I run it using the statements defining who the user is, I only get the information that the user is entitled to see. So if I go ahead and run that, let me run the entire script, I get 3 cases back, 3 cases only. And the reason for that, Jerry, is very simple. My user 1001 is set up in a location where they only have access to these 3 different cases. And to prove the point, if I change to a different user, say user 1003, and I run that, I'll get a different set of results. So let me scroll down to the bottom of my screen. All I get is one case, case 111. Now, another aspect which is interesting here is that not only does the performance not depend on how much information we're dealing with, so whether you have 1 case, 20 cases, a million cases, the performance will be the same. Another interesting aspect is that many authorization solutions might only work at the application level, which means that if you get database access, you can circumvent the security. By using the Axiomatic's data access filter and attribute-based access control on the database level directly, you can no longer circumvent the authorization. You can see here that I'm using Oracle SQL Developer. I'm right down there in the database, and yet the authorization is still being applied. So no matter the entry point, be it an API on top of the database, be it a web portal on top of the database, or be it the database client console itself, the authorization is being applied. And on that note, Jerry, over to you.
All right, thanks very much, David, for showing that. We definitely see customers that like the idea of having one place to secure their access to databases. We've seen this in the area when customers have multiple business intelligence or business analytics tools and many other scenarios. So we're really excited to be able to provide this new offering. All right, so from here we'll make a few concluding remarks and then turn to our Q&A session. So we hope that you've seen through this webinar that by implementing ABAC, some of the objectives that customers have are to try and get a competitive advantage over others in their verticals, or to be able to roll out new services or products faster than their competition. We also looked at the opportunity or the goal of minimizing risk, being able to have that real-time and dynamic access control, going away from things like least privilege to what I call exact privilege. Global regulations and privacy requirements. Privacy remains a very interesting area, and we see so many subtle privacy requirement differences across countries and regions that customers are really trying to now incorporate into their access control infrastructure. And then, of course, cutting time to market based on your internal development staff's efficiencies and making their lives much easier and simpler. So some of the benefits we talked about was that secure collaboration, even when you're dealing with very sensitive and valuable and highly regulated data. Being able to go fast as well as secure in implementing financial transactions. Compliance, we can't get away from it, and we can't say it enough, having to deal with compliance, but do it in a very efficient way. And then finally, reducing your total cost of ownership by implementing an ABAC model as part of your infrastructure going forward. So one more note here before we go to Q&A time. David and I actually are making a field trip to Australia to meet up with John and his colleagues, Damon Jones and Barry Metzger. So in country the last couple weeks here, last week of August and first week of September, as part of a regular visit. And we hope you've enjoyed the webinar today, but also look forward to the opportunity to meet you in person while we're in town. So you can contact Damon or Barry to set up a meeting with us, and we can go into obviously much more detail on any of these topics related to ABAC and authorization. So at this point, we do have a little time for Q&A. So David, John, I'll ask you to come back online here, and we'll look through our questions and see what's interesting here. Maybe a couple for you, David, seem to have sparked an interest around the database access control. Can you tell us what databases are supported today?
Sure. So the databases that we support include Oracle Enterprise databases, Microsoft SQL, DB2. I believe Sybase is also in the works, if not already supported, Jerry. PostgreSQL, MySQL, essentially the major vendors really, and we will go on expanding that list of databases. It's worth noting that right now all the databases I've actually mentioned are all SQL-based databases, but we are definitely thinking about graph databases, NoSQL databases for the future.
Okay, thanks. And we talked a little bit about this during the presentation about filtering data for applications that are already deployed. And this is something interesting. Do we have to change the application, or can we just implement this as a proxy layer? That's an important aspect, right? Because typically with an ABAC system, it does require often some change to existing databases or applications, rather.
Right. So that's something that's a question I really like to tackle, and it's when we go see customers and we deploy an ABAC system, a bit of part of the game is to try to be as unintrusive as possible. So that's what I call it, the intrusiveness, I guess, or intrusivity. You have your pick. And when it comes to deploying the ABAC authorization in the application side, if you've already exposed your applications as APIs, as web services, then all you have to do really is deploy a proxy in front of it, and the application is none the wiser. You're protecting the application without it being aware of it. So that's a very efficient model, a very practical model. And if you turn to the database authorization, it's also a very elegant model because the application logic itself does not need to be changed. It still connects to the backend database and retrieves data the same way. The data format doesn't change, so the application does not need to know that you've deployed a database proxy in the middle. The one minor change you do need to do, though, is that you do need to pass down from the application to the database the identity of the original caller. So sometimes applications will connect, or typically applications will connect to the database using a system account. The system account is not what we're interested in, though. We're interested in the actual identity of the end user. And what we found from our customers impacted by compliance, customers in banking, customers in the healthcare and the insurance sector, is that they already passed down that information for compliance purposes. So we can, in fact, leverage the existing setup very often, and therefore have no to very little impact on the applications.
Right. And John, I think we can apply this low intrusiveness factor to enterprise APIs as well, right? By implementing the gateway at that level. Do you want to speak to that a bit? Or are you muting yourself there?
Okay, I was centrally muted, but yes, we've got probably about half a dozen customers who have been investing and building around the enterprise API space for the last year or so, and they're finding that they can have phenomenal access to data that was previously locked up through various security policies. And they are now turning to applying the access controls through ABAC to render that data useful, and to also combine it with other big sets of data that they're collecting for their clients, and then wrap interesting policies around that can be changed on a dime to reflect locations or different offers or different business conditions. There's a whole gamut of business applications that they're thinking of dreaming up.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, and I just like the way you can use APIs to extend these legacy applications that otherwise are very difficult to change and adapt to more modern techniques. All right, David, back to you. Here's another question. If the database query is being rewritten based on policies as you had described, isn't that likely to result in suboptimal queries being sent to the database?
That's a good question. No, it depends. The bottom line is if you've configured your system correctly, if you've modeled your policies correctly, if you have your authorization under control, then no, it will not lead to suboptimal queries. It will lead to queries that are of course potentially bigger and therefore slightly just a tad slower than the original SQL statement. But the difference will be negligible, and do keep in mind that it will be less expensive to do it that way than it would to deploy authorization in other locations in your application. But it's true that when we go to customers, we do need to make sure that they do write their policies the ABAC way, that they do their attribute modeling correctly, that they do their authorization modeling correctly, and that they do their data modeling correctly.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because if you apply, say, an RBAC approach to an ABAC system, you are in essence gumming up the works. So there is a skill to be sure that the policies are written correctly, that the database views, and that the indexes are also in alignment. And that's just part of the implementation plan, to do these testing benchmarks for performance to make sure that you're not making the system slower than it was previously. Okay. Next up, any comments on what customers are doing today to secure database? Uh, I mean, what comes to my mind, David, are things like stored procedures, or even more hard-coded application logic that post-processes data. So I might do a select star, and then I've got code in my application that will redact columns or otherwise filter data. But then you have the stored procedure, the stored SQL, which is sort of like an RBAC model because you're trying to predict what's the right kind of access, and I'll build a query that represents that, and then you just execute the store procedure. Are you seeing those and other things in sort of legacy systems?
Absolutely. We'll see stored procedures at best. We'll see custom legacy code here and there at worst. And actually, in some cases, we'll see nothing at all, where either access has been granted to all the data or access has just been denied because the customer fears so much that the wrong data will be released that they'd rather not release the information. And the main problem with the legacy approach is that first of all, you implement authorization using whatever you have available, so it's not going to be standardized. So you're going to have an expert on stored procedures. You're going to have an expert on Java code, on .NET code, on this framework, that framework, and not only do you need those experts, that's subject matter expertise, and that's a relatively expensive way to maintain your authorization. You're also going to end up with what I like to call authorization silos, meaning that you're going to have islands of authorization logic here and there, and in between those islands, in between those silos, you'll have gaps, and those gaps are extremely dangerous because they represent a chance for a malicious user or just for any user, whether the intent is malicious or not, to access information they should not be accessing. So it is really fundamental, it's really important that you be able to centralize your authorization logic and have one enforcement point, one interceptor or a set of interceptors that all go back to the same authorization server to deliver consistent authorization no matter where you connect from and no matter what type of application you're dealing with.
Okay, excellent. Can you describe a little bit about how you code the authorization policies on database resources? Because it is a
Uh-huh.
little bit different than, say, an API resource or a service bus or um, a menu item.
Right. So when you write policies in an attribute-based access control environment, and in our case we use as the underlying technology, we use XACML, the Extensible Access Control Markup Language. We always strive to write policies in a business-minded way, in a business-driven way, such that the policy be the same no matter where you do the interception. So the ideal situation is that you've written an ABAC policy in such a way that you can apply it to databases as well as apply it to APIs as well apply it to the presentation tier. But you're right, Jerry, that sometimes it's not the way. Sometimes your policy is going to be specific to the presentation tier and might make mention of widgets. So in the case of databases, of course, our policy will mention the table you're protecting. It potentially could mention the columns you're protecting. And then once you've gone beyond those two specific attributes, if you will. The rest, the metadata, say the location of the case in the police scenario I showed you, or the location of the user, these are going to be standard attributes that you can use across the presentation, the business, the API, and the data tier.
All right, very good. Thanks for explaining that. Well, I think we've run through our questions here. I think at this stage we'll close down the webinar. Thank you, David, for doing the demo, for your part in the presentation, and for answering some of these
Sure.
very good questions. Also, John Habers for joining us and for hosting us here coming up in less than 3 weeks. Look forward to meeting up with you in some very interesting customer settings. And of course, thank you for attending. And if you do wish to meet up with us in person, just let John's team know, and we'll get that set up. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you on the next Axiomatics webinar.